The demand that had been hanging over my dad's company like weather if I would sign a comprehensive confidentiality agreement covering all family and business matters. Read that again. They'd stop pretending they deserved a slice of my father's company in exchange for my silence about why they didn't. Natalie called it what it was. They know what you have. Somewhere in 15 months of discovery, despite our care, a thread had shown. A subpoena that brushed too close to Horizon Supply. A deposition question. Brian's lawyer objected to a shade too fast. They knew. And instead of panicking, they'd priced it. That's the thing about Patricia's world that I'd finally learned to see. Everything is a negotiation, including the truth. Especially the truth. Every scandal has a settlement figure. Every crime is just an invoice nobody's sent yet. And they were so sure I'd take it. Quiet little Emily, who kept every piece she was ever handed, who signed welcome packets and swallowed toasts. Of course, she'd trade the ugly truth for a clean exit. It's what she'd done her whole life. I told Natalie to decline politely without a counter. Her reply made me laugh out loud in an empty apartment. Declined. They just learned something about you. Expect them to get louder. They got louder. Word reached me through my mother that Patricia was telling their circle I'd had some kind of breakdown and was trying to burn down both families on my way out. The county's dinner party circuit ran on her weather system, and the forecast on me was pity with a chance of contempt. That's when I broke my own rule. Half of it. The freeze bound me at the company. Nothing bound me at my parents' kitchen table. On Memorial Day weekend 2026, while my mom took a casserole to a church thing, I set Sophia's report in front of my father and I didn't say a word while he read. He read for 40 minutes. My dad is not a document man. He moves his lips a little when he reads legal language, a habit I've loved my whole life and would defend with violence. Somewhere around the receiving log appendix, the lip movement stopped. His hands went still on the pages and his shoulders came down. And I watched a man watch 5 years of his handshake get autopsied. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. And what he said broke my heart cleaner than anything Patricia ever managed. You don't fire family? But it came out different this time, smaller. It wasn't a law anymore. It was a question. The sound of a man asking whether the sentence he'd built his whole decency on had been picked up and used against him like a crowbar. No, Dad, I said, and I took his hand across the table. You don't. But somebody redefined family while we weren't looking, and I'm going to need you to trust me about what happens next. He was quiet a long time then. What do you need from me, Emily? My whole life I'd waited for that question. A phone call? I said in 3 weeks when I say now, I want to tell you about the night before the settlement conference because it's the night the real war got decided and I was the only one in the room. Everything was staged. Sophia's reports backups the cancellation letter drafted. My dad on standby, like the cavalry and sitting in my apartment with cold tea, I caught myself designing the quiet version. You know the quiet version? Hand the report to Dad. Let him retire 27 people with severance and a handshake. Let Horizon Supply lapse into some negotiated sunset. No press, no police, no scene at any table. The version where Emily fixes everything and no one ever has to know Emily was right. I had been building quiet versions my whole life. Quiet versions are what over-responsible daughters make instead of scenes. We metabolize the family's poison in private and call it strength. We sign the welcome packets. We keep the peace like it's a baby we were handed at birth and told not to drop. And staring at that cold tea, I finally did the arithmetic on it. 15 years of my quiet had bought the Whitakers time, cover, and $1.9 million. My silence had never once protected my family. It had protected the scheme. Those are the words I said out loud alone at 1 a.m., and saying them felt like putting down something I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped calling it heavy. It had just become my posture. If the truth stayed manageable, it would stay deniable. It had to cost something in daylight, and the person it had to cost was me, my name, my privacy, my precious reputation for being reasonable. I texted Natalie at 1:14 a.m., "Take the deal to the mat. I'm done being the quiet one." She replied at 6 sharp. "About time. Here's what I traded. And I want you to hear the actual numbers because this is the part where people usually look at me like I've lost my mind." The marital estate centerpiece was our house in Upper Arlington, sold during the proceedings for $640,000. My share should have been around $320,000. There were retirement splits, a spousal support question mark, and Brian's attorney still making noises about the company's growth during the marriage. At the final settlement conference in early June, Natalie put one package on the table, I would take 40,000 from the house, 40, and waive support, and the retirement split entirely. In exchange, every Whitaker, by name and by entity, permanently released any claim, interest, or valuation demand against Harrington Mechanical, its ownership, and its assets, with a clause Natalie drafted so tight it practically squeaked, covering Brian, Patricia, Derek, Theodore Lang, Horizon Supply, and I'm quoting any affiliated person or entity, known or unknown. Their side read it, and you could watch the calculation move through the room like weather. She's paying us to go away. $250,000 of walkway money from the tired, unstable, about to be broke ex-wife. They signed so fast the notary had to ask them to slow down. Natalie looked at me one last time before I initialed. You're paying them to let go of your father's company. You understand that? Every dollar I said and signed. And that was the door closing behind me for good. The old life, the house money, the soft landing, the option of ever pretending none of this happened. Gone in blue ink by my own hand. People think the point of no return is something that happens to you. Sometimes you buy it. June 16th, 2026. The final hearing took 11 minutes, which is an insulting amount of time to end 9 years. But I've come to appreciate the efficiency. At 9:31 a.m., the judge signed the decree. My marriage was over. The releases were live, and the freeze, Natalie's 15-month leash, dissolved like sugar. Brian didn't look at me in the hallway. Patricia wasn't there. She considered courtrooms vulgar, which, given how much of her life's architecture depended on them, was a luxurious opinion. I walked out onto the courthouse steps into ordinary June sunshine, stood beside a bronze statue of somebody or other, and checked my watch, which I had synchronized. Literally, I'm not being cute. With the deadline calendar taped to my wall, 47 hours and change remained on the Horizon Supply cancellation window. They were betting I'd go home and exhale. Instead, at 9:40 a.m., 9 minutes divorced. I called my dad, who had been sitting by his phone since 7 because I'd told him now would come today. Dad, it's done. It's time. Fire all 27. Carl has the files. The labor attorney has the letters. Security's briefed. Melissa goes first before she can touch a single record. There was a pause. And in it, I could hear 34 years of you don't fire family being set down gently, like a tool that no longer fit the job. Already got my boots on, my dad said. 64 years old, and he sounded 20. I laughed, standing on the courthouse steps in a gray dress, newly divorced, financially gutted, holding a phone in one hand and 47 hours in the other. You've been waiting to hear how that phone call went? So had I for 15 months. What I hadn't planned for was who'd be standing at my door by dinner time. I wasn't in the building for the firings. Natalie's last piece of advice, and a good one. Let it be the owner's decision executed by counsel, clean as a health inspection. But Carl called me that night and narrated, and I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to me because Carl Dobbs has waited 22 years to be the interesting one at dinner at 11 a.m. My dad, the labor attorney, and a note taker set up in the small conference room. 27 meetings, 10 minutes each. Papers and folders, documented, lawful, boring on purpose. No shouting matches, no per walks, undisclosed conflicts of interest, related party transactions violating signed policy. Termination effective today. Here's the severance condition. Here's the door. Melissa Holt went first before her badge could open one more personnel file. And according to Carl, she said almost nothing, which chilled me more than a scene would have. Professionals don't argue. They call someone, Derek Whitaker argued. Derek demanded my father's loyalty, then his gratitude. Then, losing altitude, cited his own initials on the receiving logs as proof of his diligence, which the labor attorney wrote down very, very slowly while Derek watched him do it. On his way out, Derek kicked a trash can. And I want you to appreciate that out of everything, the trash can is the part my dad still brings up. Delighted, like a boy describing a foul ball he caught. By 4:00 p.m., it was done. 27 desks. Security collected badges with the tenderness of a hotel checkout. And Brian never came in at all. At 4:20, my phone lit up with the only message he'd send me that year. You could have done this quietly. I read it twice, put the phone face down, and said to my empty kitchen, yes, that was the problem. I was still standing there when the knocking started. Hard, flat-handed, urgent, not the police kind, the family kind. Patricia Whitaker had never once visited my apartment. She would replay that dance for the rest of her life. The warmth of the ovens at her back, the the low hum of a stranger who no longer felt like a stranger, the way he'd looked at her like she was something worth being careful with. When the song ended, he didn't step back right away. He just looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, the stillness in his eyes looked less like armor and more like want. It didn't last. 3 nights later, Roman texted her at 11 that he'd been pulled into a meeting across town and might be late. Alex told herself it didn't matter, that she'd baked alone for years before him and could do it again for one night. But the bakery felt different without him in the corner seat, bigger somehow, and colder. The string of small sounds she usually ignored, the hum of the walk-in cooler, the tick of the old radiator, suddenly loud enough to notice. She kept glancing at the door. She told herself she wasn't waiting for him. She was lying. The bell over the door rang at 2:47 a.m., and it wasn't Roman. 2 men walked in wearing the kind of smiles that never reached their eyes, and Alex knew, with the instant clarity of a rabbit hearing a hawk's shadow across the grass, exactly who had sent them. The taller one flipped the sign on the door to close without asking. "Mr. Voss wanted us to remind you the notice period ends Friday," he said, strolling behind the counter like he owned it, running one finger along the edge of a cooling tray. "He also wanted us to mention that he's heard you've had company lately, late-night company. Mr. Voss doesn't love competition for his collateral." Alex's blood went cold. "This has nothing to do with anyone else. Everything has to do with everyone else," the shorter man said pleasantly, and picked up her father's rolling pin off the wall, turning it over in his hands like a threat wearing a smile. "Pretty little bakery like this. It would be a shame if it burned before Friday instead of just closing quietly." Her hands were shaking so hard, she had to press them flat against the counter to hide it. She thought of every version of bravery she'd ever seen in movies and found none of them inside her. "Put that back," she said anyway, because silence felt worse than fear. "Feisty," the taller man said, amused, leaning both elbows on the counter like he had all night. "Your father was smarter than you. He knew when to stay quiet and just pay what he owed." "My father is dead," Alex said, her voice cracking despite herself, "and he never owed anywhere near what Voss says he does." "Numbers are numbers, sweetheart." He shrugged, unbothered by the correction, and reached for a lemon roll off the tray without asking, taking a bite as though the shop already belonged to him. "Whatever the paper says, that's what's true. Friday." The shorter man set the rolling pin down at last, only to pick up her father's photo instead, turning the frame over in his hands with deliberate slowness, watching her face for the flinch he knew was coming. The taller man laughed, low and unbothered, and set a folded paper on the counter like a receipt for a debt she'd never agreed to owe twice over. "Friday," he repeated, softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. The door hadn't finished swinging shut behind them before Roman was through it. Alex never saw him arrive. 1 second, the 2 men were laughing at their own joke on their way out, and the next Roman had the shorter one pinned against the display case hard enough to crack the glass. His voice a low and terrible thing Alex never heard from him before. "You touched her rolling pin," he said, as if that alone were the unforgivable offense, and something about the flat, total calm of it frightened her more than shouting ever could. The men left bleeding and considerably less confident, scrambling for the door the way men do when they've suddenly remembered they are, in fact, replaceable. Roman didn't chase them. For a long moment, he simply stood there in the wreckage of the display case, breathing hard, his eyes still carrying the flat and terrible calm Alex had never seen from him before. And she realized, watching him, that the stillness she'd mistaken for gentleness all along had another face entirely. One that had likely ended careers and occasionally lives. He turned to Alex instead, his hands gentle, even as his knuckles split open. And for the first time, he told her everything. His last name was Ashford, that the empire his father built and he now ran, controlled half the shipping contracts on this side of the river. That Silas Voss was a small-time predatory lender who'd been quietly buying up debt from grieving families for years. Protected by a handful of dirty cops, Roman had spent 6 years trying to expose through channels far quieter than violence. 6 years, Alex repeated, sitting down hard in the chair by the window. "You've been building a case against him for 6 years, and he still sent men to threaten me over $11,000. "Voss doesn't know I've been building anything," Roman said. "To him, I'm just a man who buys lemon rolls at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's about to change, and I need you to understand what that means. Once I move against him openly, there's no quiet way back." He'll come at both of us with everything he has left. I should have told you sooner, he said, sitting across from her at the little table by the window, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now. I'm not scared of you, Alex said and meant it, even as her hands were still trembling from the men who had just left. I'm scared for you. Voss won't stop because you're rich and dangerous. Men like that only stop when they have nothing left to threaten anyone with. Then we take away everything he has to threaten you with, Roman said. His own people didn't approve. 2 days later, his second in command, a broad, gray-haired man named Dmitri, who'd worked for Roman's father before he worked for Roman, showed up at the bakery an hour before dawn, uninvited, and sat across from Alex like he was sizing up a threat instead of a woman covered in flour. You know what you've started, Dmitri said to Roman, not unkindly, but not gently, either. A man in your position doesn't fall for a baker on the wrong side of town. It makes you predictable. Predictable men get buried. I'm aware of the risk, Roman said, his voice flat and final in a way that ended the conversation before Alex could decide whether to be offended. She's not predictable, Alex said anyway, because someone talking about her like she wasn't in the room had never sat well with her. She's just done pretending she doesn't want something for herself for once. That's not the same thing as being weak. Dmitri studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. And then, unexpectedly, he almost smiled. No, he said slowly. I suppose it isn't. He left without another word, but Roman told her later it was the closest thing to approval the old man had ever given anyone. It was Alex, not Roman, who found the answer 3 nights later, buried in a shoebox of her father's paperwork she'd been too heartbroken to open until now. She sat cross-legged on the bakery floor at midnight, papers spread around her like a snowfall, and something on the 3rd page made her go very still. Voss's original loan documents didn't match the numbers on the most recent notices. The interest rate had quietly changed twice, without a single new signature authorizing it. A violation so basic and so provable that Alex, who'd done her father's books since she was 17 years old, recognized it the moment she saw it stacked side by side. Her hands trembled again, but this time it wasn't fear. She had almost missed it. The first 2 times through the box, her eyes had skimmed past the numbers, the way grief makes you skim past anything that hurts to look at directly. It was only on the 3rd pass, cross-referencing the original signing date against the payment schedule stapled behind it, that the discrepancy jumped out at her. Small and undeniable, a single decimal shift that had quietly doubled what her father owed over 18 months without a signature anywhere in sight. Her father had taught her at 17, sitting at this exact counter, that the numbers never lie even when the people behind them do. She hadn't understood what he meant until tonight. He inflated it, she said when Roman arrived that night and found her still sitting on the floor. Illegally. I have proof. Actual, notarized, dated proof right here. Roman knelt beside her, scanning the pages twice, then looked at her with something fierce and proud moving behind his gray eyes. That's not just proof, he said. That's a weapon, and it's yours, not mine. You built this, Alex, not me. Together they took it to the one person Voss couldn't buy. A state financial regulator Roman had been quietly feeding evidence to for years, a woman with tired eyes and a spine of iron who took one look at the altered contracts and started making phone calls before Alex had finished her coffee. Voss's operation collapsed within the month, buried under fraud charges that had nothing to do with mafia politics and everything to do with a baker's daughter who refused to let a dead man's dream be stolen from her twice. The debt was voided in full. The bakery, for the first time in almost a year, belonged entirely to Alex, free and clear, her name and no one else's on the deed. The regulator's office called it one of the cleanest predatory lending cases they'd built in a decade. Reporters wanted a quote from the young baker who'd found the paper trail no one else had noticed. Alex gave them one sentence, standing behind her own counter in her own bakery. My father taught me to always double-check the numbers. Turns out that's the only inheritance that mattered. Sophie cried when she saw it printed in the local paper and called Alex twice that night just to hear her sister's voice, steady and unafraid for the first time in a year. On the night the papers came through, Roman found her exactly where he'd found her the very first time, icing lemon rolls at 2 o'clock in the morning. Except this time, there was no eviction notice in the window, only string lights she'd hung that afternoon out of pure, stubborn joy. You saved your own bakery, he said, leaning in the doorway the way he had on the first night, watching her the way he always watched her, like she was the only steady thing in a world built on shifting ground. "You carried a lot more than papers," Alex said, and this time it was her hands that reached for him first, flour dust and all, closing the distance between them before he could. He pulled her in without a word, and the old radio on the shelf found the same slow song it always seemed to find. And this time there was no debt hanging over them, no danger waiting outside the door, only two people who had found each other in the one honest hour of the night. They danced between the display case and the ovens, her cheek against his chest, his hand warm at her waist. And Alex thought that maybe grief didn't have to smell like loneliness forever. Sometimes it smelled like cinnamon and second chances and a man who kept coming back for one more dance. Months later, the little table by the window would still be Roman's table, and the string lights never came down. And every night at 2 o'clock in the morning, the bell over the door would ring, and Alex would look up, already smiling before she even saw who it was. Sophie visited on a Sunday that spring and found Roman elbow deep in flour, badly failing to shape a batch of dinner rolls under Alex's patient instruction. His charcoal coat hung on the same hook where her father's apron used to hang. "So, this is the 2 a.m. man," Sophie said, arms crossed, fighting a smile. "You didn't mention he can't bake." "He's improving," Alex said. "I am standing right here," Roman said deadpan. And Sophie laughed so hard she had to sit down. And for the first time since their father died, the bakery on the corner of Maple and 9th felt entirely uncomplicatedly full again. Dimitri still came by most Fridays for a lemon roll, gruffer than anyone else who walked through the door, but always the first to ask how the ovens were running. Silas Voss's name never came up again, not once, not even in passing, as if the whole city had simply agreed to let it sink beneath the surface where it belonged. And every night, without fail, when the last customer had gone and the street outside had gone quiet, Roman would sit down whatever he was doing, cross the narrow space between the display case and the ovens, and hold out his hand. "One dance," he'd say, every single time, like it was the first time all over again. And every single time, Alex untied her apron and let him pull her close, the ovens warm at her back, the string lights glowing above them, and the whole aching, hard-won life they'd built together, humming quietly between them like the last note of a song neither of them ever wanted to end. If Alex and Roman's story kept you up past your own 2 o'clock in the morning, hit that like button before you go. We're just getting started on the next chapter of their life together, and you will not want to miss it. So, make sure you're subscribed and ready when it drops.